The morning light crept through the cracks in the thin wooden shutters, washing the cramped cabin in a pale, dusty glow. Mary Ellen moved quietly across the small room, careful not to wake her daughters too soon. Anna, just turned 6, lay curled on her side beneath a patched quilt, her thin arm wrapped protectively around Grace, who was 4, and still clung to her older sister in sleep. Mary Ellen brushed a strand of hair from Grace's face, smiling softly despite the ache in her cheek. The bruise was tender, a deep purple blooming under her skin, hidden as best she could by her hair. She had learned to hide these marks the way some women learned embroidery, by necessity, with practiced skill. The fire in the hearth had burned low overnight, and the air carried a sharp chill that bit at her fingers. She knelt, feeding the embers with a few small sticks before setting a kettle of water above the flames. The scent of the lingering ashes, mixed with the faint smell of the lye soap she had used last night to scrub the floor after her husband had stomped in muddy-booted and scowling, she moved quickly, almost silently, her bare feet padding against the worn boards. The rhythm of her mornings was predictable. Tend to the fire, dress the girls, fetch water, make the walk into town for whatever she could afford. Outside, the world was still damp from the night's dew, the grass bending under the weight of it. She stepped out with a wooden bucket in hand, glancing instinctively toward the barn where her husband sometimes worked in the early hours. He was not there. She could hear faint snoring through the open window of their bedroom. Relief washed over her. At least the morning would start without his sharp voice. The well stood a few yards from the cabin, a weathered structure of gray boards and a rope darkened by years of use. Mary Ellen lowered the bucket, listening to the hollow echo as it splashed into the cool water below. She drew it up slowly, careful not to spill, and carried it back inside. The girls had stirred now, Anna sitting up to rub her eyes, Grace murmuring softly in her sleep. Mary Ellen set the water aside, fetched their simple cotton dresses from the small chest, and helped them dress. She braided Anna's hair, smoothed Grace's curls, and pressed a quick kiss to each of their foreheads. By the time they stepped outside, the sun had lifted above the low hills, casting long shadows on the dirt path to town. Mary Ellen carried a small cloth purse tied with string. Inside were a few coins, enough for flour, a bit of salt, and maybe, if she bargained well, a small wedge of cheese for the girls. Anna held her mother's hand tightly, Grace clutching the hem of Mary Ellen's skirt as they walked. She kept her gaze low, nodding politely to the occasional passerby but avoiding conversation. In this town, words spread faster than the wind, and she could not afford the weight of more gossip. The town's main street was a patchwork of noise and movement, wagon wheels clattering over the packed earth, horses shifting in front of the blacksmiths, the scent of fresh bread drifting from the bakery. Mary Ellen steered her daughters toward the general store, the wide double doors open to reveal shelves stacked with goods. Behind the counter, Mr. Harlan gave her a curt nod. She returned it quietly, moving through the aisles with the careful efficiency of someone who knew exactly what she could afford and what she could not. It was here, as she counted out the last few coins for flour, that Thomas Callahan noticed her. He had been standing near the doorway, his broad frame casting a shadow across the wooden floorboards. Dressed in worn work clothes and a dusted hat, he carried himself with the easy steadiness of a man accustomed to long days under the sun. He'd come in for nails and a new bridle, but his eyes settled on the young woman at the counter, on the way her shoulders hunched slightly, on the small hands of the 2 little girls clinging to her skirts. She didn't look up as she paid, sliding the coins across the counter with care. Thomas didn't speak to her, didn't intrude, but the image stayed with him as she left, her daughters trotting to keep pace. He'd seen her before, in passing, always with the children, rarely with her husband, and though he didn't know the details, he'd heard enough to piece together the shape of her life. Later that afternoon, the saloon was lively with voices and the sharp clink of glasses. Thomas was there only to settle a small matter with the barkeep. He preferred his ranch to the smell of whiskey and sweat, but he found himself pausing near the far end of the bar when a familiar voice rose above the rest. Mary Ellen's husband sat slouched over a glass, his words thick with drink. He laughed loudly, drawing the attention of those nearby. 2 girls, the man said with a bitter grin. "That's all she's good for. Thought I'd get a son to carry my name, but no. Just two little mouths to feed and no use to me." His companions chuckled uneasily, glancing at each other. "Can't even look at her sometimes. She's nothing but a burden. Maybe I'll send her back to her father. Let him deal with her." Thomas's jaw tightened, the muscles in his face still as stone. He kept his eyes on the grain of the bar, forcing himself to remain silent. Confronting a drunk in a public place rarely ended well, and this wasn't the time. But the words dug deep, and as he stepped out into the late afternoon sun, the image of the young woman in the store returned. Her quiet manner, her guarded eyes, the way her girls clung to her. He had no way of knowing then just how soon their paths would cross again, and under what circumstances. The wind carried the smell of rain long before the first drops fell. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of slate, and a low rumble rolled across the plains. Mary Ellen could feel the weight of the air pressing down, heavy and restless. She had learned to read storms the same way she read her husband's moods, by the subtle shifts in light and tone, by the way the wind bent the tall grass and made the animals restless. Anna and Grace were in the corner of the cabin, coloring on scraps of paper with bits of pencil. Mary Ellen glanced at them often, measuring how much time she had before the storm arrived. Her husband was already in a foul temper. He had come home earlier than usual, smelling of whiskey, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the dishes on the shelf. She knew better than to ask why. He sat at the table, boots muddy, eyes sharp with the kind of anger that didn't need a reason. His voice cut through the small space like a knife. "We're out of tobacco," he muttered, as if she were somehow responsible for the lack. She said nothing, busying herself with mending one of Grace's dresses. The needle trembled slightly in her fingers. She knew where this mood could lead. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. A faint metallic creak came from the well bucket as it swayed on its hook. She rose to secure it, but his voice stopped her. "Sit down. I'm talking to you." The girls froze in the corner. Mary Ellen lowered herself back into the chair, eyes on the dress in her lap. "You think you're clever, don't you?" he said, leaning forward. "Walking around town like you're something worth looking at. Those girls," he jabbed a finger toward Anna and Grace, "they're the proof you've failed me. No sons, no future." His words were sharp, each one meant to pierce. She didn't respond. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the only shield she had. The storm outside broke suddenly, rain pelting the roof in heavy sheets. Thunder cracked so loud it made Grace cry out. Mary Ellen rose to comfort her, but he caught her wrist. The grip was hard enough to make her wince. "Don't walk away from me." His face was inches from hers, his breath hot with liquor. Anna stood quickly, trying to pull her little sister away from the tension in the room. Mary Ellen twisted her wrist free and stepped back. The bruise from last week still ached under her sleeve, and the thought of another was enough to make her heart race. Far from town, Thomas Callahan was finishing his last delivery of hay to the Granger place when the rain began in earnest. He pulled his coat tighter, the brim of his hat dripping steadily. The road back to his ranch would take him past the outer edge of town. He thought of stopping at the feed store, but the hour was late and the storm was worsening. Instead, he decided to take the long way around, checking on a few outlying cabins where folks might need help securing livestock before the weather grew worse. That was when he saw the light spilling from Mary Ellen's window. The storm had turned the world gray, but the sound that carried through the rain was sharper than the wind. Angry shouting, a child's cry. Thomas slowed his horse, listening. The next sound clenched his jaw, the unmistakable thud of a hand striking flesh. He swung down from the saddle without thinking, his boots sinking into the wet ground as he strode toward the cabin. Inside, Mary Ellen's husband loomed over her, voice raised above the storm. "You'll listen when I speak." His arm drew back again, but the door burst open before the blow could land. Thomas stood in the doorway, rain running from the brim of his hat, eyes fixed on the man. The room went still, except for the hiss of the storm outside. Thomas's voice was calm but carried an edge that brooked no argument. "You're coming with me." Mary Ellen's breath caught. She looked from Thomas to her husband, fear flashing in her eyes. Her husband's face twisted into a sneer. "This ain't your business, Callahan." Thomas stepped fully inside, closing the distance between them. "It became my business the moment you raised your hand to her in front of those girls." His gaze never wavered. For a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering the roof. Anna clung to her mother's skirt, Grace hiding her face against her hip. Mary Ellen's heart pounded so hard she thought it might break her ribs. She knew the danger in defying her husband. She also knew the danger in staying. Thomas held out his hand, not forceful, not demanding, but steady. "Come on, let's go." Her husband's voice rose again, full of threat. "You take one step out that door, and you'll regret it." But when Mary Ellen glanced down at Anna, at Grace's trembling little shoulders, something inside her shifted. She took Thomas's hand. The movement was quick. A bundle of dresses grabbed from the chair. The girls, coats pulled on with fumbling fingers. Her husband barked her name, but Thomas was already leading them toward the door. Rain drenched them instantly, the wind nearly pulling the door from its hinges. Thomas lifted Grace into the saddle, then Anna, before helping Mary Ellen mount behind them. He swung up onto his horse in front, guiding them into the dark curtain of rain without a backward glance. The storm swallowed the sound of the cabin door slamming behind them. Mary Ellen kept one arm tight around the girls, the other holding the saddle, her cheek pressed to the damp fabric of Thomas's coat. The wind whipped her hair across her face, but for the first time in years, she felt something other than fear. It was still dangerous. There would be consequences, but she wasn't alone anymore. And as the horse carried them further from the cabin, further from the man who had kept her in chains she couldn't see, the pounding of her heart began to match the steady rhythm of hooves against the rain-soaked earth. The storm had not eased by the time Thomas reached the outer fence of his ranch. Sheets of rain slanted across the fields, and the wind bent the grass almost flat. He guided the horse through the main gate, the iron hinges groaning under the strain of the gusts, and made for the barn first. The building stood solid and tall against the wind, lantern light glowing faintly from within. He swung down quickly, steadying the horse while Mary Ellen helped Anna and Grace down from the saddle. The girls clung to their mother, hair plastered to their cheeks, shivering from the cold. Thomas moved with quiet urgency, opening the barn door wide enough to lead them inside. The warm, dry air carried the smell of hay and horses. The sound of rain softened to a distant roar on the roof. The ranch's 2 draft horses shifted in their stalls, their large, dark eyes following the new arrivals. Mary Ellen stood for a moment just inside the door, clutching the girls close as if she didn't yet believe they were safe. Thomas hung his coat on a peg, water streaming from the brim of his hat. Without a word, he fetched 2 thick wool blankets from a storage chest and draped them over Anna and Grace. The children's small shoulders relaxed under the warmth, their eyes wide as they looked up at him. "You're soaked through," he said to Mary Ellen, his voice low but firm. "We'll get you to the house." She hesitated, glancing toward the rain outside, but Thomas shook his head. "It's only a short run. You'll warm up by the fire." He took the girls first, one in each arm, striding quickly through the wet darkness to the ranch house. The wind tore at his shirt, and the rain stung his face, but the children's weight was steady against him. Inside, he set them down in front of the hearth, where the low fire flickered. He turned back for Mary Ellen. She followed him silently into the house, her dress clinging to her legs, hair damp and curling against her neck. She kept her eyes on the floor, but he could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands trembled slightly as she held them close to her body. He closed the door behind her, shutting out the storm. The air inside was warm, smelling faintly of pine from the wood stacked by the fire. "Sit here," Thomas said, pulling a chair close to the hearth. She sat without a word, her eyes fixed on the flames. The girls were already huddled together on a small rug, their wet boots abandoned nearby. Thomas fetched more blankets, draping one around Mary Ellen's shoulders. She murmured a soft thank you, her voice barely above the crackle of the fire. He moved to the kitchen, setting a kettle over the stove. The sound of water heating filled the room. He didn't ask her questions. Not yet. She was wound tight as a drawn bow, and words could wait. When the water boiled, he poured it into 3 tin cups with a spoonful of honey each, and set them on the small table beside her. The girls wrapped their hands around the cups, blowing at the steam, sipping cautiously. A hint of color returned to their cheeks. For a long time, the only sounds were the rain against the roof, the wind at the windows, and the faint creak of the rocking chair where Mary Ellen sat. Thomas tended the fire, adding logs one by one. He worked as if he had been doing it all his life, and he had. But tonight, the motions carried a different weight. There was someone here who needed the warmth, someone who had stepped into his home with fear still clinging to her like the damp of the storm. When the children finished their drinks, Thomas showed them the small bedroom down the hall. It was simple but clean, with 2 narrow beds, fresh linens, and a quilt on each. The girls looked around cautiously, then at him, as if unsure whether they were truly allowed to stay. "It's yours for as long as you need it," he told them. "You'll be safe here." Mary Ellen stood in the doorway, watching them climb into bed. She had not smiled yet, not really, but he could see a flicker of something in her eyes, a small light that hadn't been there earlier. When she tucked the girls in, they clung to her hands, reluctant to let go. Back in the main room, Thomas stirred the fire higher. Mary Ellen sat again, her hands wrapped in the blanket. She glanced toward him once, then quickly away, as if speaking might tip the balance of this fragile quiet. "You don't owe me anything," he said finally, breaking the silence. "I didn't bring you here to collect on some debt. You and the girls need it out, that's all." Her eyes lifted to his, just for a moment. "Thank you," she said, the words soft but steady. She looked back at the fire. "I didn't think anyone would." Her voice trailed off. Thomas didn't press her to finish. That night, while the wind rattled the windows, Mary Ellen lay awake in the small bed he'd set up for her in the spare room. The storm outside seemed far away now, muffled by the thick walls. She could hear the low hum of the fire in the other room, the steady breathing of her daughters down the hall. For the first time in years, she was not listening for heavy footsteps in the dark, not bracing herself for the slam of a door. She closed her eyes, the warmth of the blanket sinking into her bones, and allowed herself to believe, just a little, that they might be safe here. In the days that followed, the storm passed and the sun returned, stretching across the fields in long golden rays. The girls wandered the yard under Thomas's watch, chasing the ranch's old sheepdog and pointing at the chickens pecking in the dirt. Mary Ellen helped in the kitchen, still quiet but moving with more ease. She was cautious around the ranch hands who came by for work, keeping her distance, but they took their cue from Thomas and left her be. In town, the whispers started quickly. Some said Thomas had taken her in out of pity. Others claimed it was something else entirely. The truth didn't matter to them. They only wanted a story to tell. Mary Ellen heard the fragments when she ventured in for supplies, saw the way heads turned. She kept her eyes down and finished her errands quickly, returning to the ranch before the weight of their stares could settle too heavily. Thomas noticed. He didn't comment, but he made a point of riding in with her when he could, his presence a silent barrier between her and the gossip. When they returned, the girls would run to the barn to see the horses, their laughter echoing against the wooden walls. And in those moments, Mary Ellen would pause, watching them, a faint smile tugging at her lips. It was fragile, but it was there, a small piece of something she thought she'd lost. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the horizon in deep orange and gold, Thomas found her in the garden behind the house, gathering herbs. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. "How are the girls?" he asked, leaning against the fence. "They're sleeping better," she said quietly. "They don't wake at every noise anymore." She glanced up at him, the last light of the day catching in her eyes. "Neither do I." Thomas nodded, saying nothing more. Some things didn't need words. What neither of them knew was that the fragile peace they had found was already being tested in town, where certain voices were growing louder. And somewhere out there, the man who had lost control of his household once was stewing over the thought of someone else's hand keeping it. The air over the plains had shifted. It was subtle at first, a restless edge that crept in with the early autumn winds. Days at the ranch still carried their quiet rhythm, mornings filled with the low murmur of cattle in the distance, afternoons warmed by the sun, but beneath it all there was a current of unease. Mary Ellen felt it without needing to name it, the same way she had once known a storm was coming by the heaviness in her chest. The girls had begun to thrive here. Anna had learned to guide the old sheepdog around the yard, calling to him with a voice growing stronger each day. Grace spent hours in the barn feeding handfuls of hay to the horses, her small fingers brushing their velvety noses. Thomas often found himself watching them when they didn't notice, his expression unreadable, but his eyes softer than most people ever saw them. Mary Ellen kept to her chores, cooking, mending, tending the small kitchen garden, but the space between her breaths had loosened. She no longer glanced toward the door every time it opened. At night she slept without the tight knot of fear in her stomach. Yet she knew the man she'd left behind was not one to let go easily. He had been humiliated in front of another man, in front of his children, and men like him carried grudges like weapons. One morning the sun had just climbed above the horizon when Thomas saddled his horse for a trip into town. "You'll be all right here with the girls?" he asked. She nodded, brushing loose hair from her face. "We'll be fine." He hesitated a moment before mounting, as if weighing something he didn't say, then rode off down the road. The morning passed in a kind of quiet that felt too easy. Mary Ellen was hanging laundry behind the house when the first sign of trouble came, the faint crunch of boots on dry dirt. She turned, expecting one of the ranch hands, but froze when she saw him. Her husband stood just beyond the fence, hat pushed low over his brow, eyes fixed on her. The girls were in the yard, playing with a stick and a tin pail, their laughter faltering as they followed her gaze. "Mary," he called, voice low and rough. She straightened, keeping her hands at her sides. "You've had your time. Now you're coming home." The words settled on her like a weight, but something in her was different now. She glanced at the girls, saw Anna step closer to Grace, protective even at her young age. "No," she said, the word quiet but firm. His mouth tightened. "You think you've got a choice? You've embarrassed me in front of the whole town. Folks are saying I can't control my own wife." He took a step forward, but she lifted her chin. "I'm not your wife anymore," she said. "Not in any way that matters." For a moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the grass. Then he spat into the dirt. "We'll see about that." He turned sharply, walking back the way he'd come. She stood frozen until he disappeared over the rise. When Thomas returned later that day, she told him what had happened. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, but his jaw set hard enough that the muscle twitched. "If he comes back, you stay inside. I'll handle it," he said. 2 days passed without incident. Then, just before sunset on the third day, the dogs began to bark. Thomas stepped out onto the porch, scanning the road. Mary Ellen moved to the window, her stomach sinking. A figure on horseback was approaching, the outline unmistakable. Her husband dismounted slowly, the rifle slung across his back, catching the last light of day. "Callahan," he said, voice carrying across the yard. "I've come for what's mine." Thomas stepped down from the porch, his boots hitting the dirt with a solid thud. "They're not yours," he said evenly. "Not anymore." The man's eyes narrowed. "You planning to keep another man's wife under your roof? What does that make you?" "It makes me someone who won't let you hurt them again." The rifle slid from the man's shoulder, the movement deliberate. "Then we've got a problem." Mary Ellen pulled the girls back from the window, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She could see Thomas standing there in the fading light, empty-handed but unyielding, the space between them charged like the air before a lightning strike. "You can walk away," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. "Or you can take another step and find out just how fast the law gets here when a man points a gun at a woman and her children." A flicker of uncertainty crossed her husband's face, but pride pushed him forward. He raised the rifle halfway before the thunder of hooves broke the standoff. From the east road, the sheriff rode in with 2 deputies, their horses pulling up hard in a spray of dust. "Drop it!" the sheriff barked. The rifle hesitated in the man's grip before clattering to the ground. Mary Ellen's breath rushed out in a shudder. The deputies dismounted, moving to restrain him, their hands firm on his arms. The sheriff glanced toward the house, tipping his hat to her before turning to Thomas. "We'll take it from here." As they led him away, the last of the sunlight bled from the sky. Thomas turned back toward the porch. Mary Ellen stood in the doorway, the girls pressed close against her sides. He climbed the steps, meeting her eyes for a long moment. No words passed between them, but the meaning was there. Inside, the fire was still burning, its glow spilling across the floor. The girls curled up together on the rug, the weight of fear slowly lifting from their small bodies. Mary Ellen sat near them, her hands folded in her lap, watching the flames. Thomas settled into the chair opposite, the room quiet except for the crackle of burning wood. Outside, the wind moved through the grass again, but this time it carried no threat, only the promise of a night that would pass without the sound of boots at the door. The days after the standoff carried a strange stillness over the ranch. It was not the silence of fear, nor the tension that came from waiting for something to happen. It was the kind of quiet that comes after a storm has passed, when the air is clear but the memory of thunder still lingers. Mary Ellen felt it every time she stepped outside, the wide sky stretching endlessly above, the grass moving in the wind, the world around her seeming bigger than it had in years. The sheriff had assured them that her husband would be held for some time, facing charges for assault, threats, and brandishing a weapon. It wasn't forever, and they both knew it, but it was enough for now, enough to breathe without the weight of footsteps behind her. Enough for the girls to sleep without waking at every creak in the floorboards. On the first morning after he was taken away, Mary Ellen rose early, before the sun had fully lifted over the horizon. The air was cool, the scent of damp earth still clinging from the rain that had fallen during the night. She lit the stove quietly, careful not to wake Anna and Grace, and set about making breakfast. There was a small sense of purpose in moving through the kitchen, cracking eggs into the pan, slicing bread, stirring the coffee pot, simple tasks she had once done with the constant shadow of anger behind her. Now she did them in peace, the only sound, the steady crackle of fire and the soft whistle of the kettle. Thomas came in from the yard, boots damp with dew, the brim of his hat darkened where it had caught the morning mist. He hung it by the door and washed his hands at the basin, glancing toward the stove. "Smells good," he said, his voice carrying that calm, unhurried tone she had come to recognize as his way. She offered a small smile, one that came a little easier now, and set a plate on the table. The girls stumbled in a few minutes later, hair still mussed from sleep rubbing their eyes. They climbed onto their chairs without a word, the smell of food pulling them fully awake. Breakfast was quiet, but warm, the kind of meal where the quiet felt natural instead of strained. After they ate, Thomas suggested the girls come with him to the barn to help with the morning chores. Anna's eyes lit up at the thought, and Grace, though still shy, followed her sister's lead. Mary Ellen watched them go, the sight of their small figures trailing behind him stirring something deep in her chest. With the house empty, she stepped outside to hang the laundry she had washed the day before. The sun was climbing now, painting the fields in gold. She worked slowly, the rhythm of clothespin after clothespin, giving her mind space to wander. For the first time in years, her thoughts drifted toward the future, not with dread, but with a hesitant curiosity. She imagined the girls growing here, learning the land, running through the grass without fear. She imagined herself in the kitchen in the winter months, a fire in the hearth, the smell of bread in the air. The images came unbidden, and she didn't push them away. By midday, the air had grown warm, and the girls came running back from the barn, cheeks flushed and eyes bright. Thomas followed at a slower pace, carrying a small bucket of fresh eggs. "These two are better helpers than most grown hands I've had," he said, setting the bucket on the counter. Anna grinned proudly, and Grace hid her smile behind her mother's skirt. The afternoon passed, in the easy rhythm of ranch life. Thomas repaired a broken section of fence while Mary Ellen worked in the garden, planting late-season vegetables. The girls darted between them, sometimes helping, sometimes chasing the old sheepdog across the yard. Every so often, Thomas would glance toward Mary Ellen, their eyes meeting briefly before they returned to their work. It was not a look heavy with expectation, only acknowledgement, a shared understanding of the space they now occupied in each other's lives. That evening, as the sky bled into shades of orange and purple, Thomas built a fire in the pit behind the house. The girls gathered sticks, tossing them into the flames with small bursts of excitement. Mary Ellen brought out a pot of stew she had been simmering all afternoon, the rich scent mingling with the smoke. They ate outside, the air cooling as the stars began to prick the sky. After the meal, Anna asked if Thomas would tell them a story. He hesitated at first, clearly unaccustomed to such a request, but then began to speak in a slow, steady voice. It was a simple tale about a clever fox and a stubborn mule, the kind of story that made the girls giggle at the right moments. Mary Ellen listened, her gaze resting on him as the firelight caught the lines of his face. She saw the way his eyes softened when the girls laughed, the way he seemed more at ease with them than with most adults. When the fire burned low, the girls grew sleepy, leaning against Mary Ellen's sides. She guided them inside, tucking them into bed. Thomas remained outside, tending the last of the embers, but when she returned, he was at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee. She poured herself a cup and sat across from him. "They're happier here," she said quietly. He met her gaze. "So are you." It wasn't a question, and she didn't try to deny it. There was a long pause, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable, just full of the things that didn't need to be said out loud. "You don't have to decide anything now," he added, "but as long as you want to be here, you will be. No one's going to take that from you." Her fingers tightened around the cup, the heat seeping into her palms. She nodded, the weight of the promise settling over her, not as a burden, but as something solid she could lean on. That night, as she lay in bed, she could hear the soft murmur of Thomas moving through the house, checking the locks, making sure the fire was banked for the night. The sound was steady, reassuring. She closed her eyes, and sleep came easily. In the weeks that followed, the routines deepened. The girls learned to help in the garden, gathering herbs and vegetables for supper. Thomas showed Anna how to saddle one of the gentler horses, leading her in slow circles around the yard while Grace watched from the fence, clapping when her sister managed to stay upright. Mary Ellen began sewing in the evenings again, something she had not done since before her marriage, the quiet scratch of the needle and fabric filling the room. The whispers in town had not disappeared, but they no longer seemed to matter as much. The ranch felt like its own world, set apart from the pettiness of the main street. Every time Thomas rode in for supplies, he returned without mentioning the talk, and Mary Ellen did not ask. One night, after the girls had gone to bed, they sat together by the fire. The air between them felt different somehow, not tense, but charged with something unspoken. Thomas looked into the flames for a long moment before saying, "You've done more for this place than you realize. More for me." She tilted her head. "I haven't done anything but stay out of the way." "That's not true," he said. "You've made it a home again." Her breath caught, and she looked away, not trusting her voice. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Somewhere outside, the wind moved through the grass, the same sound it had made the night she arrived. But now it carried no threat, only the reminder that they were still here and still safe. Sometimes, the greatest acts of courage aren't found in gunfights or grand gestures, but in the quiet choice to protect and to stay. For Thomas and Mary Ellen, the Wild West wasn't just a place of hardship. It became the land where two wounded hearts found safety, trust, and the hope of a new beginning. If you enjoyed this story and want to ride along for more tales of love, resilience, and second chances in the untamed frontier, make sure to subscribe to Wild West Love Chronicles so you don't miss the next unforgettable journey.